Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fireside chat or panel discussion, because we're 4 people on internationalization of European startups today. My name is Lisa. I'm the co-founder of Localize, and I'm moderating today's session and very much looking forward to it. We have a wonderful lineup, and I've also had the privilege to have worked with all of you in the past. So very much looking forward to the discussion today. We will start with a quick introduction of all our panelists today, and then directly dive in. So that's like kind of the plan. There will be a Q&A in the end, so all of you will have the chance to ask your questions to our panelists as well. But before, I'll have some questions. And just like starting with the introduction, first we have Anna. Anna is a global talent leader and has led large international recruitment teams at a wide range of recognized employers like N26, Zalando, Molly, and a few others. And now she's also investing into startups, mostly in the HR and fintech space, and also in Localize. So very happy about that. And also welcome to you, Anna. And it would be great if you could also just share a few words about yourself.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I'm Anna. Indeed, my background is mainly on the talent side. So mainly work with fast-growing tech organizations to help them scale from a strategic point of view, but also build the operation. So build large recruitment and talent teams to deliver on those ambitions. So I've seen hypergrowth multiple times. I'm very gray underneath. That's always my joke. I joke about it. And since 2 years living, I think, the dream, because I started invested with Noor. But I think Noor will touch upon that later.
Nice. Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's great that you're joining us today. Next up is Kim, the Director of Talent at Point 9 Capital. Kim's focus right now is on collaborating with the Point 9 portfolio to build the essential talent infrastructure needed for Series A and beyond. So welcome, Kim, and also handing over to you so that you can say a few words about yourself.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And focused Point 9 a little bit more on seed, but also Series A and beyond as well. So that's my area of specialty, and helping companies to scale, I guess, both in their home countries and then expand as well. So super interested in the discussion that's going to happen today.
Nice. Very happy to have you. And last but not least, we have Noor in our panel today. Noor has been part of leadership teams of well-known organizations throughout her career. Just to give you a few examples, Noor was Chief People Officer at N26 and VP People at SoundCloud, and is now, as Anna mentioned, also investing together with Anna into startups. So also handing over to you for a quick introduction.
Cool, thanks, Lisa. I think you already did a beautiful intro, so it's difficult to top it off with some new info. But let's focus it on invested indeed. So since 2 years, Anna and I are helping late-stage growth companies with strategic people and org challenges. So that can be like, how do you set up for internationalization from an org structure perspective or from an executive team perspective? But also how do you get a good composition of your board through different phases. And the money that we make with that, we all reinvest in the startup scene, always, as Anna said, HR tech and fintech. And we mainly focus on underrepresented founders. And we're very passionate in the HR tech side and excited investors of Localize.
Very passionate and very excited. I can second that. Thank you so much for joining. And yeah, just to start with a little bit of background information, like also on the topic we would like to discuss today. I found a number which I myself found like pretty impressive, because European startups got more than 160 billion funding in 2021. So I think that was quite an impressive number. And according to the OECD, startups see a growth rate of 20% per year in the first 3 years. And at some point, companies have to go global and also get more international. And of course, there is a certain risk involved. So companies need to have a strategy in place. And there's actually a lot to take into consideration, and it's never easy, I would say. So more than 50% of startups actually go international within the first year, and in the EU, more than 86% of the companies internationalized in the first 3 years. And I can only speak for Localize. We also did that, and we also expanded quite a lot. So definitely also true for us. But maybe Anna and Noor, starting with you, both of you have worked in international companies and also invested in a lot of startups. So what would you say, what are the 3 most important things to consider for startups when starting with international expansion?
Yeah, I think the first question to answer is what's the core focus and purpose of your internationalization, right? Is that coming from a market expansion perspective, or is that driven by talent expansion and business? Of course, if you look at the market expansion side of things, you need to have a very clear strategy, right? Why are you going to certain countries? Is there a certain demand from customers to be more localized? And do you actually have, and then review like what's the right market size from a country perspective and a country lens? And of course, taking into account if there is a product market fit in those specific regions. From a talent perspective side, of course, you need to really realize like, what are you looking for in terms of internationalization? Is that specific talent that you're looking for, is that present in that location? And how mobile are those talents to actually join your organization, and how attractive is that place from a reload perspective, but also from a regulatory and tax purposes. So that are some of the first things to consider, but I'm sure Noor has a couple more.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, it's also important how you think about it from an org structure perspective. So something that we see go wrong very often is that because you're growing so fast, the actual core team is already super overwhelmed. But because of the opportunity, everyone is excited about, and that opportunity can be twofold, either from a consumer perspective, or the CTO has heard that there's all this available tech talent in Tel Aviv and now wants to go to Tel Aviv. Doesn't really matter what the reason is, but there's excitement about that international office. But actually, the core organization is not behind it because they can't handle it. And what we see happening then a lot is that people say, we do it standalone. It's fine. We'll get a GM and they will organize it standalone. And that 9 out of 10 times goes wrong, because if it's from a market perspective, but also from a talent perspective, there's always a high integration with the core home. And if you build a team in full isolation and there's no buy-in for the core team, and the core leaders and functional leaders in the headquarters don't feel responsibility for the success of that location, that location will be frustrated very, very quickly and will be distracting your core organization. So making sure that your internationalization journey is a journey carried by everyone, but excited by everyone, with people in also your first location feeling responsibility for the success of that other location is very important.
Yeah, I liked also what you said on just like bringing the GM in another geo and then it works. So I think like that's definitely like also something I heard before. Kim, maybe also to get your perspective into that, because you also have worked with like different companies, not only in Germany, but overall like very much European based. So what would you say is important on that side?
Yeah, completely agree with the previous comments, but I think what I would add to that, even at a more basic level, like, and I think this probably sums up some of what's been discussed already, but are you ready to actually hire, right? Do you have the infrastructure in place? And I think the first thing, certainly that I have seen in the past with founders, is we need to expand for market reasons. We need to go to, let's say, the US, for example, but you're not thinking about the compliance kind of challenges that you may face there. You're not thinking about the compensation philosophy that you may have. You might not be thinking about what the talent market looks like, for example. Like, there's a number of different things that I think go in before you can just say, right, let's go. And it's something that often I see comes as an afterthought, especially in those earlier stages. I think it was interesting when you were saying about, was it 80% or so? I can't remember the number exactly in that first year. If you think how early on that is in a founder's journey, like they're probably not even thinking about this stuff. So those would be even the basic things that I would consider, and then you build out from there.
Yeah, I agree. When I think about our first year, going international back then would have been a challenge. I would say it like that. So I can definitely agree. Would you say, if you look at like European founders, that there are like certain international markets which are prioritized? Just like speaking about myself, US, of course, always like kind of the biggest market. But are there like any other countries where you say, okay, that's like normally on the radar of European founders?
Yeah, I think indeed US is a good one. Also one to be very careful about. I think it goes wrong more often than it goes well, especially when you do it very early on. And to what Kim and Noor are saying, your core team is not ready to support. But I think from a European perspective, depends of course where you're located. But very attractive one is of course Germany, right? Especially when you're focused on the SMB market, we see a lot of companies that actually want to go into Germany and actually quite struggle to do so. And I think Germany is a good perspective and example of really understanding culturally how employment and expansion works. But what I've seen quite a lot of times is that startups are excited to land in Germany, but then don't understand that there is no brand and that Germans normally are hesitant to actually joining, startups that don't have an office, for example, in Germany, right? So really thinking through like how do you expand and what's important in that local culture is important to realize, right? And to speak to local people that have done that successfully, or not local people, but people that have landed successfully, and to use some of those best practices in those countries can be very helpful to do that successfully. And I think another one is definitely, depending on what you're looking for, is the UK, right? But I think Noor, you can elaborate a little bit on that as well.
Yeah, and I think the UK is a good in-between positioning when you want to go to the US. Like if you're from mainland Europe, some of the UK practices, well, Kim is based in the UK, so it will also be interesting to hear, like if the UK wants to expand. I think from my perspective, it's not always focused on mainland Europe, but way more towards the US. So I think the movements are going in that direction. But I think with all international expansions, wherever you go in Europe, I'm not surprised that European countries go internationally faster than US companies, because basically for us, if we want to go to another state, we're in another country. But we shouldn't underestimate that the level of complexity of going to another country is more than just a talent perspective. You can already have an international team within Europe. Internationalization from talent doesn't need to be having the highest level of complexity. But going from a product perspective shouldn't be underestimated, depending on what your element is. I think the UK does operate different than a lot of the regional hubs in mainland Europe, and a great bridge to the US. But don't be naive. Like, make sure that you have local people in your starting team in the UK as well when you land there. But I'd love to hear, Kim, what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, I agree. It's not the easiest, certainly when I see companies from mainland Europe looking to move over to the UK, and it does happen obviously fairly frequently. It's not the easiest. Luckily, I'm here to help guide them on that journey and some of the cultural nuances that may be there, so they have a benefit in that sense. But equally, I think to flip that and think about, from my perspective, being in London, UK citizen, and kind of thinking about expansion to Europe, why doesn't that? I still bucket UK as Europe, by the way, but anyway, that's the side. But yeah, we think about, Germany, France increasingly, as well as places that people are expanding to. Portugal, naturally, I think for engineering hubs, as you were touching on, the Netherlands as well, would be another area. So I think those generally tend to be one of those, not necessarily all of those, tend to be like a prioritized hub for people to build out of. Kind of depends on what the needs are on this end goal ultimately for that particular company, and then obviously to the US. And I think to your point, I do think it's a nice stepping stone to the US to come to the UK first, and completely agree in terms of having like local people. I also love the model, and probably relevant to other things that are important to consider, but that land and expand kind of model, and having some culture barriers go to that specific country and start to interview in the kind of model of that company and expand from there. So yeah, that's my perspective on that.
And talking about those bridging countries, I also have to think about it. What we see increasingly in companies that we invested in is that Latin America is really open to European countries and picking up. If you're talking about HR Tech, for example, they're very focused on Europe, and you see that Spain is really a good bridging point. That, for example, Mexico is very focused in their solutions on Europe. And then if you expand to Spain, it's easier to get a connection. So it's also interesting when you're building your internationalization strategy to think like what will come next and making sure that your first step of internationalization is a bridge to that next step that you might want to achieve in the future.
Yeah, and that's basically that actually building that strategy carefully is really a big advice and a big lesson that we have seen for a lot of organizations. We've seen, especially from a talent perspective, when companies want to expand, a lot of times there's no real research done. One of the co-founders of one of the commercial leaders thinks, hey, Lisbon is a great place to be. I see myself relocating there, and then starts to kind of sort of do research that that's an amazing place to be. And then this engineering leader says, yes, great, let's do it. And yeah, my strong advice will be to really do in-depth research about that talent piece and availability and those bridging zones. Like, what do you ultimately, where do you want to go, in which regions, and could this location help you to get there before making a decision, instead of making the decision and then build your case upon why you should go to that location.
Yeah, I've had a lot of experience. Sorry, just on that topic, I've had a lot of experience of that kind of after the fact thinking, where things end up filtering down to your talent team, and then you're having to explain why you can't quite hire at the pace that was expected, right? And I think that's from broad strokes assumptions to your point on tech, and various countries are this happens in. Ultimately, there's an assumption that there's a wealth of tech talent there, right? And then you get there and actually start to dig into maybe your language specifics on the technical side and realize actually the market's quite small. And then you're in this like really awkward situation where you're having to kind of navigate and think, was this the right market? So I think on that point is a really important point. And again, things to consider, maybe bringing in, if you have a talent function existing already, or you can lean on anyone on the talent side of things, for sure, get that advice first, understand a little bit around like the talent market sizing and if it's actually a viable location for you, right?
Yeah. Thanks for adding that. Before we dive more into the hiring side, just because we spoke about the US and all of you had to laugh a little bit because it looked like that you have some war stories to share on that side. Why expansion to the US was challenging. So what would you say are like one or two like super big challenges while expanding into the US? I think like Noor, you mentioned that hiring a GM and then just like being like, yeah, that person will figure it out. But what else have you seen in portfolio companies, or also like companies you invested in or you work for?
Yeah, the GM piece I've definitely seen working out in the US, and then they are very far away and lonely and frustrated. That's not a great situation. So I think definitely when you go to the US, you want to do what Kim was mentioning, having those carriers from headquarters go there and have local talent. The US is a very different beast. So I can give a lot of operational examples, but like very simple on reward to make it very pragmatic. In the US, all your talent want ESOP. And when you're headquartered in Europe, you have your ESOP plans, but they just want to have stock. So then you're coming in, you're Dutch, and you're like, we have a stock appreciation rights. You've not heard of it, right? No, because the Netherlands is one of the few countries that has that in the world, right? So, and they're amazing, but we're the size of a stamp. So you need to translate those programs, and even with the more standard ESOP programs, I've seen a really big struggle with US talent coming from the Valley to explain like, no, it's a European plan. It's also very cool, right? So don't underestimate that all of those pieces are also coming into play. And I mean, your founder might say, oh, easy, we set up an US-based option plan. That's actually really difficult. So thinking through how how many talents are you going to invest in the future? How do you want to build out? A second thing is that when you're telling leaders talent is very expensive in the US, it's very different until they're feeling the burn rate every month, right? So building through those cases, like it is a very different price tag when you are building up your office in New York or San Francisco, because you're very likely, or Austin, like going to those primary locations. And then also, if you're going to the West Coast, don't underestimate the time zone, because you think like the US feels very close by because you're watching television, US television all day. But if people are working actually on a 9-hour difference, it's much more complex to get everyone constantly aligned, especially if you need longer co-working sessions on a recurring basis. So especially on those operational, pragmatic items, keeping the US close to Europe and making it sure that there are equal hubs and that you weed out all of these things that just distract from the actual work, it will help if you think it through.
Anything to add from your side, Kim or Anna?
I think from my perspective, it's the nuances, right? And you were talking about war stories there, and there's a repeated story that I hear, and I don't know if everyone else agrees on this, but it's often when founders are hiring their first salesperson, right? A European founder hiring their first US salesperson, and it's like, I just cannot read this culture at all. Everything's great, everyone wants to join. And like, that's not to offend any US people watching, but I think there's like a cultural nuance there, and trying to read that process becomes very difficult. And then also, I think depending on the culture of your particular like home hub, if that makes sense, like, and trying to translate that across to the States, right? For the same reasons, right? How your communication style, even for example, can get completely lost across that ocean. So that's one of the kind of common challenges. Comp obviously comes up all the time in the expectations, and I think for that, if you're truly thinking about expanding to the US, for example, mapping out, you know, what is the kind of first layer of hires that you're going to do? What does the comp actually look like based on market data? And then having that understanding, to your point, Noor, of like, how is that going to hit my burn rate? And am I comfortable with that, or am I not comfortable with that? And being able to make those decisions. And maybe, you know, we think about US obviously as West Coast, East Coast, but like, where do you position yourself on that spectrum? And is that comp driven? Is that domain experience driven? What are you looking at? I think there's a tendency often with founders to think, we're building a tech product, let's go to San Fran, right? And then they see the compensation there, and it becomes very painful very quickly. New York isn't wildly better, but marginally so, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think maybe, Kim, to add on that, I think that's a good point also from, it made me laugh, and I know we come to the hiring, Lisa, but just want to make a point. I think it is actually for many Europeans very difficult to hire American talent and really kind of distinguish the good from the great. So it's very valuable to see if you have any cultural bridges that you can tap into, right? Do you know someone that understands that market, that understands how to actually define that good from the great? Because they all say amazing in our eyes, and we're struggling to kind of filter through. So going there, that's something to really think about, right? Is there someone in your organization or someone that you can tap into that can help you understand and see those nuances?
Yeah, totally agree. Thanks for sharing that perspective, because I definitely understand what you mean, and I think it's sometimes, like, also for me, it's really tough to like see these like nuances, etc. So maybe just like coming to hiring, because we spoke about it a lot, and I think like all of us are passionate about that. So I think like we spoke a lot about also like getting salespeople in at the very beginning, and of course that's like kind of logic. But Kim, maybe on the hiring side, so if you see a company expanding internationally, so which positions are crucial to fill? How do you actually also best get started at the very beginning?
I think it's difficult for any one person to dictate that, right? It's about what's important for the founder, and I think that differs, right? Obviously, I think someone heading sales, if you're moving to the US, that's probably you're going to market there, right? And that's probably your foundational things of how you're going to build out that go-to-market team. It's probably the first place that you look, and then I think outside of that, if you're deciding to build a hub, then you start to look at engineering, product, and so on and so forth, like customer support, depending on the nature of your product. So I think those are the initial kind of positions that I see companies repeatedly look to build when they first launch to the US.
And do you also see that tech and, like, for example, go-to-market departments are then like also split it up? Because I think like also what we spoke about is like the compensation in the US, so that you have like the go-to-market teams there, but then tech team is still in Europe. Did you see something like that as well?
I think, yeah, it's quite often, especially initially. And I think that probably comes back to Noor's earlier point about like reducing burn, right? Like, and you start to build out engineering if you don't necessarily need it there, and it's cheaper to build that in Europe from a comp perspective, then it makes sense to do that. Fundamentally, you can't get away with not having go-to-market people in the US, right? Whereas you can probably get away with having engineers, certainly initially. Now that, depending again on the nature of your product, may change when you're starting to think about support, for example, and you're following like a follow the sun model, and you need that in different time zones. But certainly initially, yeah, it's the go-to-market. You end up with this split and divergence, which can be quite interesting. And engineers also very rarely have an understanding of quite how well compensated US salespeople are, which can also be painful if you have salary transparency, which is increasingly becoming a thing. So yeah, mindful of that, I guess.
Yeah, definitely agree. Cool. And maybe Noor, because you saw a lot during like your career. So what would you say is very important also like when you scale a team globally? So I think like also when we look at N26 is an example. So of course they are like based in Germany, but then also expanded to other countries. What would you say is like most important if a company really has like different hubs and all of them are supposed to grow?
Yeah, it comes back a bit to that feeling globally responsible for all locations and not build it completely in isolation. So I fully agree with what Kim said on product and engineering. But for example, if you're talking about N26, like the expectations of a bank and of your card in the US are very different than in Europe, right? So they're used to reward systems, for example. So if you want to build up a product and tech team that has experience with that, you will have to do it in your go-to-market. And I think a lot of fintech companies will see that. But it's important that you then have people who, for example, work on the more infrastructure side, who also are dedicated to the US. So making sure that in all the teams, and you can literally do that with physical things, right? If you have people still going to the office, making sure that the people who are all supporting the US, for example, are on the floor with the US, right? I know that with the UK team, we had a big carton doll of the Queen standing in that corner. So all the people in the team that was supporting Brazil had big Brazilian flags there. And the US team was US branded. And why it's important is that every time that the people came over from those countries, they would sit in that hub with their colleagues from their country. And it really gave this sense of ownership and connection with that country, right? So that was also the group that would say, oh, now for periods in time, we are going to work on New York time, because obviously we work for the US, and with N26 that was based in New York. So making sure that from an org structure, that there is a global responsibility, and especially in that phase of seed Series A, but also Series B, that the pre-IPO, I think a functional, organized, central structure has still a lot of benefits when you're growing. Making sure that that responsibility is really there. Making sure that your leaders visit the locations very often, even if you have a remote culture, but be physically present, because you think you know what's happening in a remote location, and you can have contact every day. When you are a week in a remote office is when you really feel how painful it is, or that how well the feedback is lived. And then making sure that all the teams supporting that country really feel that country connection, that there's some kind of a community and bonding, even though they're all on different locations, I think will help the success of that.
Yeah, and very pragmatically, the moment you start expanding, you need to realize that a lot of the things, how you have operated, probably needs to change quite a bit. So think about town halls, right? How often I've seen organizations that expand to a different time zone keep the town hall at the same time, and then they record it, and then the other side can just kind of step in whenever they want it, right? That doesn't really create an inclusive culture where people collaborate. So really thinking through, okay, so what does that mean for how we are organized is very helpful, and can just, the effect of little things can be really big, on how it felt on the other side.
Yeah. I also like what Kim mentioned earlier, having these like culture carriers, and then really like making sure that this is also like something which is taken into consideration, because I think it's a super important topic. And because we spoke about like also cultural differences and overall diversity, Anna, why is cultural diversity, what would you say, one of the key success factors for being successful with international expansion? So you mentioned the German market initially, so maybe you have like one or two other examples.
Yeah, so we work with a lot of, I think, global organizations, and I think the key to success is being culturally aware. And that's not saying that you understand you come from different cultures only, right? And that you are inclusive about that, but how are communicating styles, how are collaborating styles differ throughout the organization, and how do you tailor for an inclusive workspace? So for example, and one advice that I definitely have for founders that want to expand towards different cultures, to read The Culture Map. It's an amazing book and an eye-opener for many of us. And I think the one of the big differences, for example, is that going to, for example, Africa or Asia, from a European standpoint, is that we are communicating high context. We're low context communicators, meaning we're quite clear and precise in what we're saying, and you take that for face value. Where in high context cultures, the actually thing that you say could mean different things. Yeah, and you already, when I say it, you can already see the miscommunication. And then if you're looking, and well, what we see a lot is, if you get that, you think that all European countries or the Europeans and Americans are very similar. The biggest miscommunication actually happens to cultures that are rather close to each other, because there's an understanding that actually we understand each other, right? So where, for example, Americans are also low context communicators, they're very indirect in their feedback in comparison with the Dutch, right? As an example, or comparison to the Germans. So that can also lead to a lot of miscommunication. And I think to really understand that and also cultivate that within your organization, and use some of the best practices, can help to, understanding and lead to less misinterpretation, which also result in your products, right? I think this also comes with the go-to-market setting. You really need to understand that culture to be successful.
Yeah, agree. Thanks for sharing. And I, of course, have to ask the question, because the year is coming to an end. So if you think about 2023, and international expansion is on the roadmap for a few companies, what would you say are definitely things companies need to consider, or just like overall make sure they do it? And I think like we spoke about like the strategy already, but are there like any other things you would say, hey, this is like super important?
I think we touched on this earlier, but like understand the market you're thinking of expanding to. Like, speak to other founders, other people that you know have gone through and done that. And there's a couple of things actually. That's one of them. When you're thinking about doing that expansion, I think it's quite common for founders to not necessarily sit and reflect about what they messed up the first time around when you were building in your home market. And then there's another point to that, which is sometimes, and probably prevalent with all your experiences, that want or need to expand maybe comes before you've nailed your home market. And ultimately what you're potentially ending up there in a situation where you're replicating a broken system, whether that is from an onboarding perspective, a hiring perspective, whatever it may be. Ultimately, unless you've nailed your home market and you've got that well oiled, and that's why it's quite nice to move to, let's say, another European city and kind of get that right, and then launch across to the US. So those are some of the key things that I would say to think about, alongside some of the strategic kind of infrastructure things that you will need in place to enable you to do that effectively, right?
Yeah, maybe a bit more on, it's more of a side, I'm taking a bit of a side road here, but if we're talking about the future, like, even though there are all these layoffs happening at the moment, like the talent shortage will remain. And I hope that the talent shortage will contribute to a little bit more equality in the world. So if you're going to a new location, I hope that we as people leaders and as talent leaders take a very a more open approach to not only look at, hey, does Uber have an office there? Can I hire all the Uber people? But look at like, what is the underserved part in that area? And let's not underestimate, there are also people in very Western countries who are having a difficult bridge into the labor market, and giving that more of an opportunity. And if you go to a new country, it's very often a nice momentum to also start challenging that you're not only hiring privileged people coming from top universities, but that you take a much more open mind to the talent pool that you're tapping into. So if 2023, if we as a collective people and talent community can achieve that, I think we also build up a little bit of good karma. So that would be my...
I'm here for banging that drum, 100%.
So you get laughs from the audience.
Yeah, I also just saw it.
Oh, really cool.
Anna, would you like to add something, or do you think that was a good last word from Noor?
Nobody dares to say anything after this statement. No, I'm applauding.
Okay, sounds good. Now opening the floor to more questions from the audience. Thanks for answering mine before. And we got the first one. Let's see if there's more coming in. The question is, do you have advice on how to create or keep that community feeling and connection when a new hub is opened?
I think this was touched on earlier about town halls, right? And thinking about the times that you do those. That's a key one, to have a central point. There's lots of things that you can do to have fun, right? I think, like, for those who use Slack or whatever messaging thing, just like breeding that connection between communities and like learning from each other, right? So like, what are some of the customs or differences in the country that you're launching in or internationalizing to? And like, how can you learn through that? I think you touched on cultural diversity, and I think that it sits like broader than necessarily equality, although that should be the central driver for it. It's about building products with a global lens. And I think if you don't have a global view and understand different nuances and cultures and add that within your business, then how are you going to do that effectively, right? So how do you tie that? I think have fun with it. It doesn't necessarily, the more I think you try and force these things on people, I think the less natural and like less likely it is to happen. So I think drive spontaneity, like coffee catch-ups, things like that you can kind of very easily do that take very little time, kind of drive that bridge, I guess.
And I think, Noor, you have really good examples on, also building ERGs, right, across different cultures and countries.
Oh, yeah, I want to say something else, but I can consider. Yeah, I think what's nice is about like what's important when you scale as a company in general, that you keep sub-communities. So when you grow beyond 150, it's way more difficult to stay connected. And ERGs are helpful for diversity and inclusion perspective, of course, but also ERGs or sports teams, they are all creating this small cross-functional communities. And that has a side effect because a lot of things in the company when you're early stage are weeded out because Joe from marketing knows Marie from sales and they just call each other and they solve the problem before it becomes a visible problem. And the bigger you become, the more difficult that becomes. And to making sure that informal problem solving thing in your company continues, that network, starting all these sub-communities around topics is really important, and ERGs have a really good side effect with that. And one thing I was just thinking about, I can't remember why it was triggered, but I'm just going to share it anyway, is that you make the headquarter also a country. So what happens very often is that, for example, if you start in Germany, that Berlin, and you start in Berlin, that Berlin remains referred to as the headquarter. And then by definition, all the other countries are becoming second tier. And I think what happens with internationalization is what you also should do is make Germany a country. So now you start talking about Germany as a country, and not before that, when you were only in Germany, Germany was also your global business. And making that transition and separating the wording headquarters from talking about the different markets is also important, so that they all are on one level.
So we got some interests on the ERG because we got a follow-up question. Is the right time or size to start creating ERGs? What would you say?
I think you will feel it from the org. So it becomes, in my experience, there's always a very intuitive way. And I don't know if Julia is a people leader, but as a people leader, I initiate it when I get so many questions around diversity and inclusion around a certain topic, that it becomes natural for the org to get some structure around it. And that's then the natural moment to start introducing the concept of an ERG. And to say, if it's women in leadership that comes up first, that you say, hey, this is a framework to self-organize. And as a people leader, I want to know what comes out of it. And then you share that broadly with the organization, and the organization from that can start new ERGs. And then the amount of ERGs will grow over time. I haven't found an exact timing when it comes up. I think naturally it comes up just after that 150, when people cannot connect anymore as a community. People also start looking for reconnection. But I don't know if Kim and Anna, if you have a more specific answer to that.
No, I completely agree with you. I think fundamentally it's often the size of the organization that drives that. But I think sometimes it starts to get embedded a little bit earlier, depending on the founder mindset as well. If it's like super important to the founder and they think through that lens, then maybe it happens a bit earlier, but wouldn't disagree in terms of like the rough approximation of size that you're talking about there.
Yeah, we just crossed 100 employees, and I can definitely see it happening soon. So can agree to that as well. We actually got another question in, so the audience is getting a little bit more active here. And in an unfamiliar market, what successes or best practices have you found putting your value proposition up against the local known competitor in that country?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think there's no.
It's not an easy one, I would say.
No, there's not one answer that works for all. I think one of them, and I think I've spoken about this quite a lot, so I'm probably repeating myself if you have heard me talk before. I think when you're smaller, there's still, and I think N26 is, for example, a really good example. I've called out Molly a lot of times. I think now I know some people from Molly are watching, but it's like when you're small, you can do witty things, right? You can put yourself out there. You can do scrappy but cool things that differentiate yourself. And I think the things that you currently that might land well in that certain culture to raise awareness of your brand. I think to think that through is really an important exercise, and then put a cultivated lens on that, or cultural lens on it. Meaning, if you do only witty things when you are a startup from Spain going into Germany, might not work out, right? Because that will just make you feel very startup-ish, and that might not be the trigger for some people in Munich, where you landed, to join your organization, right? So you always need to kind of think through, like, what is important for that specific culture, so you can also tailor and take that into account. But bottom line, don't be shy to be original, to be able to stand out. That's my general comment, but maybe Kim or Noor have some more success stories.
Would agree on that. I think there's a couple of things. Like, I think if there's a talent shortage and you're specifically looking to attract the exact same talent as a competitor, which happens fairly frequently, like the first thing I would say is, like, how well do you understand what their value prop is, right? Like, do you understand it inside out and what it is that attracts people, and like what are some of the detractors there, right? So I think mapping that stuff out is super important, and then understanding where you're different. Like, I think there's, as an example of this, that Instant in 0.9 portfolio, they do employer brand really, really well, and they don't do fully remote. Now, lots of people obviously want fully remote, but they've realized there's a huge part of the market where they can go and tap into, where people actually don't want that. They want to be in an office environment, and they're aware of that and really push that. It's just like a differentiator for them. And then I guess the last piece of advice on that I would give is that talent people, I don't think enough tap into the marketing and sales experience within their organizations. Like, we always just kind of sit in our bubble, or typically sit in our bubble, rather than leaning on like this incredible expertise that we have, operational expertise that we can just go and tap in and tell us how to do those things, right? So that would be the thing I'd say. Go and speak to those people. They're the experts in understanding this stuff, and like see what you can get from them in terms of like tools, tips, tricks, and things to do there.
And maybe to add on that, there's also to make sure that your leadership also feels that responsibility to bring your company to market, right? So it's not a recruiter, sales, marketing kind of play. It's a leadership play. So how do you ensure you use your founders and your senior leaders to kind of land in a certain culture or country or region? And how do you ensure that they are becoming thought leaders, right? So are they present on those local events or moments where decisions are made in that region? I think is also one to remember. And I've seen frequently that founders feel and senior leaders feel it's a talent acquisition play and they just need to work it out. Where the ones where I saw it very successfully done was when founders and leaders were heavily involved.
Yeah, because that's in my experience, but the other two are way more talent experts than I am, is that when we launched in new countries, is doing a lot of meetups and hub and with senior leaders speaking there, because you have the new kid advantage. People want to learn new stuff, and you're coming in with new leaders who are sharing stuff, and leaders need to be brought into it. In the second phase, I would actually embrace your competitor, because there is no market with hidden talent. So you will also need to relocate a lot of people to that talent, and your employer competitor needs to do it as well. And sometimes teaming up and co-hosting an event, because someone is an insurtech and you are a mobile bank, hosting an event together, bringing international talent all to Lisbon, for example, and then see at the event, like we're so different, trusting that you will differentiate and some talent will go to them and some talent will go to you, but you're marking now the location together as a fintech hub can actually also be very attractive.
Yeah.
I would not lose too much energy on focusing on a competitor and just fly on your own strength and just say, you can buddy up with me and storm off. Wait for that.
Alternatively, I'd just add to that, if you love the competitor's talent and you want to go and take it and you can't take it from the competitor, it's usually pretty easy to get the insight. Like recruiters can be sometimes, it's the wrong term, I'm just going to say a little bit lazy by default, and there's repeatable patterns, right? So if you look at any company that you admire, they probably hire, and there's a pattern there from who they typically go and hire from, right? Because usually if you get success, you'll go back and rinse and repeat on that in terms of how you approach it. So that would be another way to get in a little bit earlier and steal the talent maybe before it gets to the competitor. But like completely agree with Noor's mentality, stand on your own 2 feet and stick your stake in the ground there.
Yeah, definitely agree to that as well. So no more questions, not from the audience and also not from my side. So thank you so much for joining us and for sharing all your insights. It was a lot of fun. And just to make some advertisement for the next session. So we do have the next session at 4 p.m. today with our talent acquisition lead, Stephanie, and she'll be speaking with Adrian Kove and Brett Jones about hiring beyond borders. So stay tuned for that, and thanks again for joining, and enjoy your day. Thank you.
Thanks.